So, Dr. Amol Deshpande, how do you feel about child-safe medication bottles?
Wow. I guess they're good. Unless, of course, you're a child and you really need your medication, then I guess that might be a little disappointing, but yeah.
So that ties back
Um,
to our topic about your amazing work, medical innovation. Henri Briot, pardon my butchering French accent that I haven't practiced since grade 12, created the child-safe medication bottle, and he's a Canadian. So,
yeah,
yeah,
I know
well,
that. There
now
you
you
go.
know. Now you know. Well, I'll introduce you properly after that hassle of a cold open. Dr. Amol Deshpande
That's
is our
okay.
guest today on this podcast, MedTech Talks, part of How It's Med. My name is Jeff, and today we're interviewing again another amazing guest who's shaping the future of healthcare. So, how are you doing, Amol?
I'm good. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on the show. Really excited. And like I said, I've already learned one fact, so I feel it's already been worth the time I spent hooking up with this. It's great.
Awesome. So the place that I trace all of the podcasts back to is, why someone went into the field that they're in. And you were, little bit of a spoiler, involved in medicine. So I guess what was your path into medicine? Like what triggered that interest or devotion to that career? Because it's not a small commitment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I had a really exciting narrative for you, but probably like all my other South Asian brethren can attest to, there was a lot of parental coaxing and arm twisting. I don't know if you can
I can
relate to
relate
that
to
or
that.
not, but yeah, so that's honestly what it was. Obviously we don't have to do what our parents say we do, but I think there was definitely an interest in science. There always was. But you know what? If I look back, to be honest with you, I can't think of some people in medicine have an incredible passion and desire to do whatever they do, whether it's surgery, whether it's internal medicine, whether it's research, whether it's clinical. Um, I honestly can't remember. I mean, I was always interested in medicine.
Mhm.
I love the science of medicine, but I don't know. And I'd enjoy talking to people. I still enjoy talking to people, but I don't know if there was ever that sort of deep, incredible passion. So I think it was just I happened to be at a certain place at a certain time, and it ticked off all the boxes, and so off I went. So yeah, I mean, again, I wish it was much more exciting narrative for you, but ultimately that's probably reality is how it happened.
We love some honesty. So why did
Yeah,
you end
well,
up focusing on chronic pain? That's a little bit of a step beyond
yeah,
beyond just getting into medicine. It's your fellowship. It was correct.
yeah, it is, isn't it? It's you know what? That actually probably leads again, no interesting story, but I can absolutely say with no doubt that leads off of the first comment that I had was the science of pain and chronic pain, and it's much more well known now than it was when I started the fellowship, but or when I did the fellowship. But even back then, the science is incredibly fascinating. And we're much further ahead because I think one of the interesting breakthroughs that we will finally have, and this is sort of after I've wound down my clinical career, is we're starting to understand the brain in much more detail, not only structurally, but functionally. And even at that time, we had some very sort of primitive concepts of how pain is generated,
Hmm.
sort of the Descartes model with sort of the fire at the toe and the primary afferent neuron going to the spinal cord, hitting the brain, pain. But the reality is that's not even close to what happens. But there was this huge gap between our understanding of what we think is happening and what is actually happening. We were never able to probe the actual what is happening till we got into functional MRIs, for example. And now we can actually see with much more clarity what is happening and how people are responding to sensory input. So the science at that point was always interesting, but I think it's only become more fascinating. And what's really interesting now is that we can actually start to explain some of those findings. So it was the science that brought me there.
Hmm.
The clinical aspect, I think the challenge with chronic pain is despite the science being fascinating, we don't have a lot of great therapies. And so it often leads to very frustrated patients, most importantly, and often frustrated clinicians because, no matter what we think's going on, there are very limited tools to allow us to do what we have. So,
Hmm.
yeah, interesting area. We're not quite at sort of the pinnacle of that, but it's early days yet for chronic pain relative to a lot of the other clinical specialties.
Was that I guess lack of knowledge as to what's going on at all a frustrating part of your career to you, and at all an impetus towards what you're now focusing on, which is medical innovation?
Um, I mean, I think it was frustrating as a
Hmm.
clinician for sure, without a doubt, to not have the tools to properly help patients. I think the innovation piece, I don't think stemmed from that. I was just always fascinated with how people were able to push the envelope
Hmm.
of whether it be medicine or it be other aspects of whether it be commerce, whether it be communications. I've always been interested in that, and somewhere along the way, I think the business side of things was also of interest to me. And then my undergrad was in economics, and so I kind of got back to that sort of core. And so when you put those two together, actually three, I guess, if you think about it, if you put medicine, innovation, and business together, you kind of naturally end up where I am now, which is sort of in the venture creation space, or at least supporting those great founders. So I think this is probably home for me. This is actually where I feel comfortable, right? Putting all those three pieces together, and yeah, it works. So that's probably how I ended up
I
here.
mean, that if you look back in retrospect, all that work in chronic pain where there's so much research and innovation going on, as well as your, I guess, steeping in medicine, plus that background in business, seems like a really well tied together tale. But we talked off the air about your path towards an MBA. Tell us why you got that, and any push about the pushback that you might have received in your journey to get it.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. I mean, so first of all, it does seem like connected dots, but I think it's much like, Steve Jobs' famous commencement speech, right? I mean, we don't know where we're going, but if you look back, you can often see how the dots
Yeah.
connect, or to something of that kind of, to paraphrase him. I think and I think that's very true for most of us. I think that's absolutely true for myself. Um, yeah, I mean, in terms of the MBA, I was always interested. I said, I did my undergrad in economics. I always thought I would do an MBA for whatever reason. I at the time, maybe naively and smartly, in retrospect, I didn't go into it. Thought of hospital administrator, but that ends up being a babysitter for a lot of big children. So I'm glad I didn't end up in that. But that was that was the initial premise. But again, it was one of these things where you get into an MBA and you realize, I mean, and again, we talked off air about it, but it still fascinates me even to this day, because I can remember, I did it a while ago, but the students is, you get connected with a lot of fascinating individuals who we would have never had a chance to meet, because medicine is just so, um, you know, it's so intensive, it's so focused, everything's sort of streamlined. And again, that may be a little bit different now, but being in an academic setting, I don't think it's changed all that
Hmm.
much. When I talk to the residents and stuff, it's still, it's head down, straightforward, and you often miss all the other exciting stuff going on. And so the MBA got me in touch with all that other stuff. I mean, like, you guys take the internet for granted. Like, we were just starting with,
You're
yeah,
dating
like
yourself.
as a colleague, like, say, www, right? I mean, and the screeching modem at
Oh boy.
the,
Oh no,
28
no,
baud
no,
and the
no.
56 baud, right? I man, I live that, right? And all those sort of the Commodore 64 and all, but so it was fascinating. But if you were in medicine, you missed most of that. Most of my colleagues missed it because it just wasn't part of the curriculum, right?
Hmm.
So I think we're going through another renaissance of sort of innovation, and more specifically, it's obviously happening in the general world, but it's happening in medicine. And so, yeah, I wanted to be a part of that. And so I think the MBA gives me a different perspective,
Hmm.
not just from a clinician's, and how do I use this tool, and this tool doesn't work very well and it sucks, and as opposed to imagine what this could be.
Hmm.
Like, imagine, like, because innovation just naturally gets better over
Hmm.
time. That's why it's innovation,
Hmm.
right? So it's an interesting perspective. So yeah, so I think the MBA gate got me in touch with that sort of, the fact that other stuff happens and it can be really exciting stuff, and there's ways to innovate and create new things and to help new people in many different ways.
Yeah, I mean,
So
you mentioned that there's steps going forward right now when it comes to medical innovation. I totally agree. There are so many new startups that have come about. COVID, although it's been absolutely terrible for the entire world, has pushed a lot of interest towards medical technology and funding towards it as well. But in terms of actual education and raising of the new generation of physicians, clinicians overall, have you seen any changes when it comes to how we shape the minds of those who will dictate how medical innovation goes in the future?
That's a really interesting question, and I think the answer is yes, but probably varies quite a bit in terms of where it's being taught. I think there are some specialties and areas that probably are much further ahead than
Mhm,
others. Whether that's because they were already riding the innovation curve and this kind of leapfrog them a couple of years
mhm,
ahead, or whether they were forced to. So, as a great example, I'm seeing a lot of interesting stuff happening in the surgical field, with even just in terms of how they interact with patients, how they follow patients up in terms of post-operative outcomes. How do how do you decrease length of stay? Like how do you provide some of these services so they don't have to come in? Relatively simple stuff that we think about, but people are actually digging into it now to understand how does that work. And I think there's interest in trying to get better at that. I think there are some areas where maybe not so much. If we want to call telehealth an innovation, although it's been around since the 1940s, and we're still using version 1.0. Um,
oh, wow.
if you want to call that innovation, then I think it's hit every specialty. But if you take that off the table, I think there are absolutely some specialties that are kind of left behind.
Mhm,
And whether is that because they're not interested, is it because they're not as motivated? It's hard to say. So I would definitely say it's helped. I would definitely say it's spurred, but I wouldn't say it's happened across the board in an equal way. So I think there's absolutely people who are willing to push that envelope. So
mhm,
yeah. And in terms of the younger generation, I was still practicing um, during the COVID time in an academic setting. I can't say there was a lot. Again, and this may be my very myopic perspective, but I didn't see a lot of really exciting new stuff coming out of younger
mhm.
individuals. And again, with all fairness, they're probably restricted to whatever their staff person is doing,
Yeah.
right? So they can't go off and do something totally different. But yeah, I still would say the majority of the stuff was similar to what I did when I trained,
Mhm.
right? Which is why it's kind of a little disappointing. But absolutely, it's a very small sliver of the world. So um, in other areas, I think they're absolutely punching above their weight, so to speak.
Mhm. And just one last question on this train of thought. If you could optimize the Canadian medical education system to facilitate the development of the Canadian medical innovation ecosystem, how would you do it?
Wow, that's probably a whole topic on its own. Um, so I think I would actually start to embed this stuff within medical school, to be honest with you. That's probably the easiest thing to do.
Mhm.
Not everyone's going to be an entrepreneur, no, nor should everyone become an entrepreneur, right? Not everyone needs to be an investor in this stuff. But I think you do need to get exposed to what's going on so you can appreciate um, what goes into innovation. And this is just to be clear. I mean, this is this is beyond research, right? I mean, you can be a great researcher, but it doesn't necessarily mean innovation. That's great invention, but it takes a lot of work to get stuff out of the
Yeah.
lab, if you will, and into the hands of people, right? Like that's a big, tough slog, and I think people somehow don't necessarily appreciate it all the
Mhm.
time. And so I think embedding it into medical school, is it a course, is it a capstone project, is it something where you just go spend some time, for example, with spend a month rotation, a compulsory rotation with an early venture startup. I mean, um, most academic medical schools are close enough that you can find some venture system going on, whether it be a physician or an engineer accessing clinicians. So I don't think it's that hard of a lift, but I think it's just not front and center. And part of that is okay. You've got 4 years to train these students through medical school. Something's got to give.
Mhm.
So do you kill anatomy? Do you kill some of physiology? Do you kill like something's got to give? So I realize it's easy to
It's a great
say,
question.
but I do think it's important. I mean, I really do think it's critically important for medical students to understand that, because I think that's how you get more people interested in it, right? You need to expose them to it. If you never see it, it never becomes real.
Mhm.
So that's probably what I would do. And again, it doesn't need to be 6 months. Just give them a month.
Yeah.
Just see. And those people are excited, they'll stick. And those people who aren't, that's okay. They've seen what it is and they can go on their merry way and continue with the usual routine.
Mhm.
That's fine.
So talking about development, you did your MBA around the turn of the century, but you're,
Wow.
I'm dating you hard.
What, you made me sound like a Model T Ford.
It can come in any color that you want as long as it's black.
Exactly.
You've done some amazing work recently that I'm going to talk about later. But in between now and back then, you've done a lot of work in health consultancy, working with some startups. What are the greatest experiences or some stories that you think have been instrumental in shaping what you're up to now, or shaping your decision to get up to what you're doing now?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know, Jeffrey, if there's sort of one specific event that I can hone in on. I would say, if we're going to pull on this innovation thread, I can tell you something that I remember that happened sort of literally a decade
Mhm.
ago, which is when I was chief medical officer of a startup before it went bust after a year and a half, before again, I'm going to date myself, the great financial crisis or 2008 and ran out of funding. But
I was in grade 7.
well, there you go. Okay. So yeah, you don't remember it at all. You were still, yeah, life didn't change for you much, I bet. Um, so what was interesting, and I still remember this, and this is why I think getting getting this to medical students early is I had been practicing for at least probably a decade and a half at that point. And
Mhm.
as a physician, you kind of think you know most everything that's going on with what patients are thinking, what they need, all this kind of stuff. And I remember as CMO, I had to do something that was very sort of unusual for me, which was go and sell this stuff at a patient
Mhm.
conference, like a diabetic association, I think is what it was. And just talking to patients, not because I wasn't a clinician, I was the CMO of this company, just asking them simple questions, thinking I already knew the answer and getting very different answers than what I expected. And probably the biggest one was, we had asked them to, um, geez, I don't even remember what it was. It was sort of ask them to engage with other patients about their sort of diabetes. And you would think as a clinician, while the treatment is different, diabetes is diabetes. You have elevated blood sugar, whether it's due to, whether it's due to resistance or you have absolutely no insulin production, type 1, type 2, it doesn't matter. Point is, I'll treat you differently, but it's the same. What you realize, and we did this to multiple women, there's to prostate cancer, and we did it to breast cancer patients, there is such an allegiance to your own disease that breast cancer didn't want to talk to prostate cancer
What?
patients, that type 1 diabetics didn't want to talk to type 2 diabetics because they were very different. And it really sort of hits you that they really align with their particular condition at that time, right?
That's
And I
fascinating.
suspect it still is true. And as a clinician, we don't think about that, but that's really sort of just individual patients, sort of just um, acknowledging their individuality, right? Like I'm a type 2 and I have certain needs and that's who I am and and I'm happy to talk to another type 2, but I don't want to go on type 1. It's not that's not who I am. Maybe because most of them are kids. Obviously that's changing a little bit now, maybe because they use different, modalities to but it was really fascinating because as a clinician, I had never ever even thought that. We don't think about them as sort of individuals. We think of them as sort of, or I did, just to be very clear, specific conditions or diseases that needed to be treated. And so that interaction as person to person was very, very insightful for me.
Yeah.
And that's always sort of stayed with me as I've gone through, whether it be medicine or whether other aspects as well. So, yeah. So again, I don't think it was, um, I don't think I gave you the story you want, but it was just very interesting from an innovation perspective and from just getting out of my usual domain as a clinician and just sort of talking to people.
I think that, I mean, you didn't give me the exact answer that I was expecting, to follow on your theme, but I think that's certainly really interesting because you're right. As you see patients day in and day out, it's very easy to see the condition and not the
Yeah.
person. But if you're ever going to go and design a product, design a clinical trial, try to market a product, you need to think of the person, how they think, how they feel, not just about the condition itself. Even though your solution may be amazing, you need to think about the person.
That's an excellent, yeah, no, and that's an excellent point, right? And you're absolutely bang on. And that's why I think kind of defines a successful entrepreneur, right? Which is knowing the end user, not knowing the end condition, but knowing the end user and what actually sort of, drives their needs and satisfies them, what they want the product for at the end of the day.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was just eye opening because as a physician, we don't necessarily walk the halls of the hospital as an individual. We walk it as a intern or resident or a staff, but that's a very different power
Mhm.
dynamic. And so it changes if you don't go in like that.
Mhm. So I'm going to talk about the recent amazing work that you've done in three different buckets. So your work in the
Mhm.
venture capital investment space, your work as now senior director of the health sciences ecosystem at Mars Discovery District, and then your work with your own podcast, which is why your audio sounds so good. So
Does it?
it
Oh, good. I'm
it is
glad.
crisp.
Spent a lot of time setting
It
that
is
up.
crisp. It's amazing. Anyway, you've taken all these projects or all these roles in the last like year or two. What spurred that change?
Yeah, I don't know if it was a change. I think I was doing bits and pieces all along and just sort of, cobbling together little things here and there, and they just happened to coalesce into a consistent theme of innovation and supporting ventures. Um, as I said, I've sort of been always playing with the venture space, either directly in it as a CMO in a previous startup or investing in companies. And then, yeah, the podcast, you know what? I've always been fascinated with podcast, and it's something I've toyed around with for a long time and just never actually pulled the trigger on it. And so finally decided to bite the bullet. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, what a great topic is to showcase great innovators, particularly in the Canadian ecosystem, and show the great work they're doing. And yeah, and then the Mars job, which was not on my roadmap at all, just happened to luckily show up. And it was one of these things where, you know what, you got to um, bleep or get off the toilet, so to speak. So that's what I did. And yeah, so I gave up clinical and I joined this. And and I think we talked about this before. Is I realized in terms of all the things that I was doing after I left the clinic was not related to healthcare, specifically the clinic or patients. It was all the other thing that I was just fascinated by, which is new technologies, ventures, business models, understanding, looking at pitch decks, kind of figuring out what people are doing in biotech or in digital or even in non-healthcare related things. So it was, at a certain point, if eventually you realize if you're doing more of the stuff that you're not doing in the daytime, you should probably be in that stuff and not your daytime stuff.
Hmm.
And so that's yeah. So that's kind of where I ended up. But ultimately, I also enjoy it because it's one of these things where one piece leverages off another, and think about it as compounding. Like if you have that happening in your life, it doesn't matter where it is, that adds up really quickly. Like you cannot beat someone who's got a learning curve where people say like what do you do after work? I don't consider any of it work. I really don't. Right? I love talking to people on the podcast, really interesting, fascinating people. I love looking at pitch decks when I'm doing, part of my sort of venture investing. I love working at Mars, trying to sort of get the stuff off the ground that we're trying to do there. So, to me, I think it's all just enjoyable. So yeah, and I think that's the goal of most people. It's hard to get to. Some people get there early, some people get there late. Unfortunately, some people never get there. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's to me, it's just cobbled over time.
So you've given a high level summary of all the things that you're doing. But one theme that I've noticed through it all, whether or not it's the podcast, your role as senior director, or your role with in the VC or angel space, a lot of it seems supportive. Why is
Yeah.
that theme there? Was it intentional?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, in my heart of hearts, would I like to be like, like an Elon Musk or some other great entrepreneur? Sure. But the reality is that I've always been good at and enjoyed a supporting role, right? I mean, I did it as an academic clinician. I could have worked in a peripheral community clinic just sort of hammering away on my own, but I didn't. Um, the academic clinics, they have their upsides, but they certainly have their downsides. But to me, that was well worth it because again, getting to interact with medical students, with interns, with residents. I really enjoy that. I mean, both, it's a two-way learning street. I mean, it's not just me teaching them, but I'm learning lots of new stuff from them. They're forcing me to really sort of dig in deep and ask questions that I haven't even thought about for a long period of time to do, you know, show certain parts of the physical examination that I take for granted. I really enjoyed that interaction. And so as a supporting role, you get to do that in spades in venture. Again, whether it's even reviewing a deck rather, even if you're not investing, and this is always a challenge, but you get to give great feedback to founders about why didn't this resonate? Like what's going on? So they get a feedback loop where they can sort of incorporate that if they want to, and so they get better for the next pitch, right? You get to do that at Mars as well when you're sort of talking to ventures or when you're talking to other team members. Why am I thinking what I'm thinking? I mean, one of the interesting concepts is I do have a clinical background, so I don't practice medicine, but they can appreciate now in the context of health sciences, it's a different opinion. I have a different stance or a different viewpoint. I don't look at this straight as technology and business. There's a clinical element that kind of comes to it and like, oh, I never thought about that. Well, that's because you haven't worked in that area. It's not because you just, you're dumb or anything, it's just you don't have that experience. So yeah, I think to me the supporting role is, I'm like a supporting actor, I guess, is I have my role and I'm quite pleased with it and it works for me. So and yeah, I guess the last thing is it's tough to be a founder, right? I mean, like I feel for all those
It's
founders.
hard.
I really, I mean, I support. It is right. It takes guts to do it. Number one, it takes guts to stay in it. Number two, and a lot of times, while we read the bylines of the ones that succeed, there's a ton that don't. So I feel for the ones that don't make it out the other end. So it is absolutely a tough gig, and I don't think people appreciate that enough. Right, all the work that they have to do. So,
Mhm,
so supporting role, I think it's an important role. So I'm happy. I'm happy with it.
mhm. All right. Well, I'm going to first take a little bit of a dive into your work in the angel and VC space. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a partner at AIoT as well as the co-chair of HaloHealth. So in those, like, how did you find those roles? And how do those roles differ for you? Or are they the same, or are they different ways to approach the same problem that you're trying to solve?
So ultimately, so they're different roles, but ultimately they're trying to achieve the same
Mhm.
thing, which is to support great, healthcare ventures through investments, so through capital allocation. How did I find them? That's an interesting story. Um, so believe it or not, the AIoT where I'm a venture partner there. I actually found him through Twitter.
Twitter?
So yeah, Twitter, believe it or not, yeah, and that was only about 18 months ago. So so social media does
Thanks,
work.
Jack
Yeah,
Dorsey.
we just got into yeah, exactly, right? I'm not quite that level yet, but let's hope. Um yeah, we just got into this, a bit of a thread, and then he made an interesting comment. He commented on one of my comments, and I just wanted to reach out, and no idea who this was, and he said he was willing to chat. I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's a bit unusual right there." Like, other than just a tweet. He's like, well, so give me phone number. I can't remember whether he DM'd me and picked him up. And there's another physician on the other end. I thought that was kind of interesting. And he was talking about some venture. So I thought that was interesting. And thinking he's in California or New York. And he's like, I'm in Calgary. Oh, okay. So we end up being in Calgary. And he happens to be in an area where we have a lot of sort of mutual acquaintances and we never cross paths at all. So we got along, and so that's AIoT Health, and we're still, we're still working together, and doing due diligence on some really interesting deal flow. So that's that, and then at the same time, I had contacted Halo Health in and around the same time. Sort of, so I thought it was interesting, angel network of physicians from coast to coast. So those are kind of the people I want to hang around with. I'd contacted them. And after I contacted this guy from the IoT, he also mentioned it, which was they were like literally a week apart. Said, "Hey, you should contact Halo Health." I was like, "Well, I just did." And so I got in touch with Halo Health, and I really like what they've done there. I love the group of people that I'm working with, and spent some time there. And now I guess I was Russian volunteered to be a co-chair, which I truly enjoy because I think there's lots of great work that we could be doing. And I love what I love about that is it's physicians on the front line,
Mhm.
right? Like these aren't these aren't physicians who are now sort of giving up clinic like myself and are in this all the time. These are frontline clinicians, family docs, neurologists, radiologist, OB-GYN, kind of like the whole full swath, who I think just realize there's more to medicine than just day in and day out clinics, right? And some are founders and investors, some are just investors. So you get a really diverse group, and so really very jazzed about HaloHealth for sure. And I think there's the best is yet to come. So let's see.
All right. Well, I got two questions here. So my first is, not all of our audience may understand what health tech investing is like. You said due diligence. Can you break down in a 5-year-old's vocabulary what actually doing due diligence or your day-to-day work as a venture partner at AIoT is?
Yeah. So I mean, that's a good question. I think it differs in terms of how you do it, but essentially due diligence really is looking at, in this case, a particular startup company. So a company that wants to basically do something in obviously in the healthcare field, as far as I'm concerned. But it can be in any field. And just looking at the company through, I'll say, different lenses to determine what the probability is that this company will make it out the other end. So, you want to look at some, I'm not going to go into the details, but I think there's sort of some common things. Like you want to look at the team, like who's actually doing this? Like, have they done it before? What's their experience? Are they in it for the long haul? Or is this kind of what we just finished talking about? Is it just something sexy for them to do? They just want to be an entrepreneur and put it on their CV, or are they really into it? What's the technology like, right? Like, is this really exciting, or is this telehealth 1.0? And I don't mean any sort of, I don't mean to deride any telehealth companies that are doing some excellent work out there, but what's the technology behind that? What's the moat? Can they protect it, or can someone else just, if this turns out to be a success, can they do it tomorrow? Is there any science behind the technology? Are clinicians, if it's clinician facing, are they going to use it? If it's patient facing, are patients going to use it? And then you want to look at sort of, venture's a funny beast. There's a lot of great technologies and a lot of great businesses. Not all of them are venture, right? And a bit of that means you have to understand the other side of that, which is what's the person who's giving you money looking for? And what they're looking for is things that scale really quickly, that you can put a lot of money to really sort of get rocket fuel to help that company go to the next level. And you can be a good business and not actually be a venture business, right? So you're looking at what the market is like. And then you're looking at sort of traction. What have they done? Right. I mean, have they been able to, could be a great idea, but if you can't actually make the product or deliver the service, or you can't get anyone to buy this product or use the service, that's not a business. It's a great idea. So I think there's a lot of lens, and there's more you can look at, but that's kind of what due diligence is, looking at all those different aspects to see, or at least to have some sense of idea of what the probability is that this company and this team and this technology is going to make it out to the other end to actually be a big business.
And to kind of add on to that, you've talked about how you essentially make an informed bet on whether or not this company is going to succeed and make an impact. But as a clinician, you can also offer amazing things such as clinical insight, connections to patients, connections to everyone who you've met during your clinical career. So those are incredibly potent tools that the startup can also put to use as well to increase their chance of success, which ties back to HaloHealth overall, because essentially with a diverse network of physicians, then you're able to provide value specific to a startup in a specific specialty that wants that advice. So you mentioned that there are amazing things that could be going on with HaloHealth. Apart from doing the due diligence overall, what directions is HaloHealth going to go in, or how can you shape the ecosystem through your work with HaloHealth and with AIoT?
So, I mean, I'm going to talk about specifics of HaloHealth because we haven't sort of sorted that out. But I think the goal of HaloHealth, it's about 2 years old, 2 years and a bit now. Started by, several really well-meaning physicians, and many of them are still there. I think the goal is, kind of what your question was earlier about medical students. This is more sort of focused on physicians, which is how do we get more physicians aware and engaged in healthcare innovation at whatever level they want to be. And so to me, that's a process. We have to attract more and more members over time. We have to get our members actually not only in front of, ventures to invest in, but we also need to get the whole ecosystem behind them. So how do we get, VCs, which is the next level up, to take us seriously? As you said, we have a lot of clinicians that can help with that due diligence. So if you're, coming up with a new orthopedic device, instead of just looking at the technology and looking at the business and team, wouldn't it be great to have an orthopod in the room say, you know what, I would never use this shoulder transplant, or I would absolutely use this knee replacement because it's much better, right? So we're starting to provide services for our members where they can now sort of help VCs or help other organizations to go through the clinical aspects of some of the technology and give those founders some real sort of frontline feedback. So that's kind of another service. So even if we're not investing, just providing them with feedback on how that works. And with AIoT, I mean, I think it's very much similar. I think the one thing that's really fascinating, and that we're sort of noodling right now, is if you look at a lot of health technology, and I'm taking biotech off the table for a second, but if you look at and maybe a little less med device, but particularly digital
Mhm.
health, there is very little clinical evidence that a lot of this stuff
Yep.
works, right? It may increase access, and that's
Mhm.
important. But in terms of looking at outcomes, and if you look at the studies that exist, even for the large unicorn companies, very few and far between. The studies are arguably of poor quality. And, the studies that are done don't necessarily focus on the target market that they're actually selling into. So, as we look at sort of evidence-based medicine, and then you look at the health innovation space, again, particularly for digital health, there's a huge gap, right? And so this is kind of one of the interesting things to me, is how do we begin to close that gap? So, you know, innovation is great. Getting things out is critically important. Ventures need to get, they have a certain time limits. They've got investor commitments. You need to run fast. But that doesn't mean we can sort of swipe, or should we swipe, all the sort of clinical, due diligences, shall we say, sort of the evidence base underneath the table. And I think that that's something that clinicians can have a great input
Mhm.
on, and that's something that we can help drive. And so that's something that I think will be interesting going forward, is being able to provide services that allow digital health companies to prove their technology in a more evidence-based manner, so that not only is this cheaper, better, faster, but it also has better outcomes, which ultimately is what's important,
Mhm.
right, for our healthcare system.
Mhm.
So that's something that I would think is, yeah, is something that'll happen in the
So you're
future.
talking health technology assessment.
Yeah, in a way, for sure. But health technology assessment kind of has a lot of holes in it,
Yep.
right? Health technology assessment often cobbles together a lot of existing data. It doesn't really apply it necessarily to specific markets or specific regions. It really takes a very meta level
Yeah.
approach and then applies it at a regional level, because you got to remember, most of this health technology assessment is done on a regional level or jurisdictional level, right? Like if the Alberta government or the Ontario government wants it, they'll go and ask for this. But none of those studies may have been done in Ontario
Mhm.
or Alberta, right? They may have been done in whatever, South America. And if it works in South America, it doesn't mean it works here, or vice versa. And so I think there's a lot of gaps in that system, and a lot of improvement to be had. It's not an easy lift, but I think that's ultimately where we will have to go and where we need to go to really get the most out of this innovation.
And that's a bit paradoxical, because if we're to try to prove the utility of a certain digital health product in a certain locale, then sure, you might get a better fit. But by nature of the fact that you may need to do multiple health tech assessments in different areas to prove utility in those different areas, that might wear out a startup's runway. Am I incorrect, or is that a paradox that you've heard of?
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. It is if you think you need to do it the old way.
Yeah.
But remember, we're digital. There's much better ways that we can do, we can gain clinical evidence. It doesn't mean we have to do an RCT every
Hmm.
time. Like we can have, federated databases, for example, where I can collect data with all the privacy and security I need, just captured at a regional level, and then actually just probe that database without actually stopping the company from doing what it needs to do, right? And maybe when I probe it for my patient set in Toronto, it works really well, and I probe it for my patient set in Timmins, it doesn't do very well. So what does that tell me? It just tells me that my technology and my customer market needs to be much more focused. Does that always help ventures? No. But at the same time, you could argue it actually potentially opens up other markets that they're also not looking
Yeah.
at, right? So I think you'll have to look net how that works out. I'm not going to say it works for everyone, but if our ultimate goal is to make a better health system, I think that's the way we've got to start looking at it.
Hmm.
And I think there's this huge move to what we call sort of real world evidence, right? Because that's, clinical trials are great, but I've rarely seen or treated a patient in my practice that looks like they'd be eligible for a clinical
Fair
trial
enough.
because they're usually
Yeah.
not, right? Real patients don't come with only one disease or with never having medications or,
Yeah. Yeah.
being, perfect BMI. Like, show me those, they don't exist for the most part. So it's really, so to me, real world evidence is much more impactful and there are ways to get it, right? We need to be, mindful of all the privacy issues, but there are ways to get it. And I think that's much more meaningful for understanding what is this technology doing for this patient set in this area.
Mhm.
And again, I think it only over the long term, it helps ventures. It validates their technology. It shows them where it works, what it does, and what the outcomes are. And I think that's fantastic.
Mhm. Mhm. So we've delved pretty deep into the development work associated with roles leading or roles shaping the angel and venture space. But I want to shift back into your role as an investor because that's something that we haven't
Mhm.
talked about much on this podcast. So, what are the hardest things that you experience as early stage health tech investor? What are the few core issues that you wish that you didn't have to deal with every day, or are there such things?
Losing money.
Fair enough.
That's a big one. No, I mean, I think so. Yeah, that's a good question. So how would I explain that? So I guess first of all, I'm not a VC. I'm an angel, and I think the first thing you need to understand is those two are very different,
Mhm.
right? And why are they different? And this is my perspective. They both support entrepreneurs or founders at a very early stage. But to me, an angel investor is really, and VCs will say this, but I really do think this happens at an angel, is taking a bet on the person, right? It's kind of friends and family round, and an angel investor just slightly above the friends and family in the last F, which is fools, right? Um, but so, but that's the reality is I'm giving money to this founder because I think they're an amazing
Yeah.
founder. Like they just have great ideas. They've got great passion. They've shown they can execute on doing things in general. Well, maybe not this particular event, but they've shown that they've got a track record. And I'm giving them a little leeway to go and have fun. If that turns out to end up being a phenomenal investment, that's great. But the reality is, if I'm doing this to make money as an angel, there are far better ways to make money because most of those bets are not going to turn out to be very good. Unless you're doing this, you're a super angel. And there are some who kind of do this and have a really deep knowledge. But I would argue those super angels are VC quality. They just like to do it on their own, right? And they have their bank sizes big enough that they can put decent check sizes, but they've got some real power to do it. But most of the angels, it's a tough. So unless you actually comes back to, unless you enjoy it, unless you enjoy supporting great founders and just giving them a chance to do what they need to do, if your goal is to make money, I would argue it's not the best place to be.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the first thing. I don't know if there's any real sort of challenges or worrying because I think if you abide by sort of, prime directive number one, what I just said, then I think the rest falls into place. I think if you don't do that, then you worry for
Yeah.
sure, right? Because then you're worried like, where did my money go? Where's my update? How's the traction going? What's your runway like? How are you gonna like? You start to worry about all these things that, frankly, as an angel, you can't
Yeah.
control, nor should you. So that's where sort of a VC comes in, sits on the board. They have great insight into what's going on. They can make decisions. They can help the founders find people that they need, either operationally or other board members. It's a very different game, and I think people often kind of get them confused, and that can be a bit dangerous sometimes.
Hmm. Hmm. So to switch the lens, what tribulations do early stage companies face when interacting with angels?
Wow. in terms of, you know, getting them to invest in their company
Sure.
or
Or
or or
getting their foot in the door and then getting invested.
yeah. So I mean, I think angels, like any other investor, have certain lenses that they look at ventures with. So they've all, if you want to think of it as they're already biased. Even before you get to the door, they're biased, right? So if someone has a sad but real interaction with oncology because their mother died and got poor care or whatever, even their pet died, they may not be willing to look at anything other than oncology, even if it's a great, amazing, whatever tech for cardiac care.
Mhm.
So in other words, they come with very specific biases. So that's often, so you could be pitching a great venture, wrong person, right? So I think that's always a challenge, is sort of aligning, um, who you're pitching to. And again, that's VC, that's angel. I think the other thing about angels is, um, know what their background is, right? So, angels come in all sorts of, shapes and sizes and backgrounds. And particularly if we're talking healthcare, you may need to do a lot of explaining if someone has no healthcare background, right? And you got to remember, just like you're trying to maybe give away a piece of your company for equity, you're also taking on a bit of a headache, because that's now becomes a very close, I'm not going to quite say partner, but certainly a shareholder.
Yeah.
And the last thing you want to do is getting calls from them on a weekly basis saying like, what's going on? What's happening? What are you doing? Like, or distracting you and telling you, hey, you should meet this guy. He could be great for your team. And those are distractions. So that's something you got to put up with. But if they've given you money, that's kind of what you're asking for as well. So you've got to just make sure that that's a fair trade at the end of the day.
Mhm.
So from a ventures perspective, I think that's just, while angel money may seem easy, it can come with a price, right? Just as VC money does. It's just, and I could argue it's even a bigger price because the check sizes are usually smaller.
Mhm.
So, and the last thing you want is 10 angels. You got to go, because it's like herding cats, right? It's like, you don't need that. So, just beware
Yeah.
is what I would say. So make sure that you're actually treat them just like you would any other, capital providers. What are they providing you? Like, do you want, and I'm not, again, casting dispersions on anyone, but do you want someone who's like an accountant on your healthcare team, which may be greatly advantageous, right? Do you want a dentist on a cardiac care kind of application? I don't know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, right? So in other words, I think there has to be some value add to that when you're a venture and looking at them and saying, okay, it's not just the check, but they've got to provide some connection, some uplift other than the dollars.
Mhm. So last question on the investing space. Um, the AIoT page talks about exponential early stage startups. What separates an exponential startup from a non-exponential startup?
Good question. If I absolutely 100% knew the answer to that, I would have been retired a long time ago, right? Um, so the so that exponential, I guess, is I would divide that into two categories. I think there's this notion of, and I think Peter Diamandis was the one who brought it out, and I could be wrong with that, but the idea of exponential technologies,
It was.
right?
Yep.
So these are, probably the canonical example is AI, machine learning, right? Which is just sort of gets better over time. You hit an inflection point and it just kind of goes up, not even up and to the right. It just goes straight up. So there's looking at, in this case, ventures that employ some of those kinds of technologies, right? As a base layer to actually deliver the service. So that's kind of one exponential. So we're looking at stuff like that, as opposed to, um, maybe more sort of traditional kinds of technology that, and I'm not thinking anything in particular off the top of my head, but things that are sort of things we use every day, and maybe they're just incrementally better. That's not what we're interested in. So that's one. Two, I think exponential is obviously founders and ventures that can really get a lot of traction very quickly in what they do, right? So what does that mean? Well, probably they're not capital intensive. They're not building big things that require a lot of dollars to get out the door, right? So obviously this focuses us on mainly digital kind of application software where the marginal cost is close to zero. So every time you kind of onboard someone, basically you pocket all the revenue because there's not a lot of incremental costs. And when you onboard that individual, they add value to all the other individuals. So you get this kind of, this network effect as it's well known. These are kind of things that when you hit that inflection point, AI or no AI, they really kind of, again, go up and to the right. So that's kind of exponential, whereas opposed to the traditional model where, you make one, you sell one, you make one, you sell one, right? It's linear, it works, it's a great business, but it's not an exponential
Mhm.
business, right? So it's just two very different models. So that's what the exponential would say. And obviously the technology and that network effect are often very tied together,
Yeah.
right? But they can be
Mhm.
separate.
Okay. All right. So now taking a step away from all your work in the angel and investing space, you started Reboot Health. What was the inspiration behind that, and why do it? You said you like talking to people. It's not work to you, but why podcast?
I've always been fascinated by podcasts. I mean, so I listen to a number of podcasts. I just like the medium. I think it's a great medium. You can do it almost anywhere. You can do it almost anytime. Here in Toronto, and don't do it anymore, driving downtown, sitting in traffic, you could, it's great to listen to a podcast. You get some learnings. I mean, now I don't even know what the number is, probably north of 2 million podcasts, if you count sort of all sort of Apple Store and Spotify and all those things. The amount of learnings you can get on any topic is phenomenal. And so that's where I first got into it. And I think there's some phenomenal, um, you know, you podcast out there with hosts and well produced. And so I think it's a really enjoyable way to digest knowledge. So that was my sort of interest in it. Um, I was going to do something around cannabis, which was my sort of academic topic. Never pulled the trigger. I did one or two episodes, but I really, it fizzled. It was done with someone under someone else's banner head, and it just didn't work out. And so I let that go. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to do this again, this was in and around the time that sort of, AIoT came, HaloHealth came, and so I figured, hey, why not just double down and again, expose or showcase some of the great founders. And what a great way to do it on a medium that I just enjoy interacting with. And most people, I think it's also easy to get people to do it, right? People are usually happy to talk about their work, whether it's a clinician who just published a recent publication, whether it's a founder who's like just launched a recent product, whether it's an investor who wants to talk about sort of their thesis or, get on the podcast to get extra deal flow. So I think it works for everyone from different perspectives. And it's just an easy way to really sort of connect with people. And as I said, I think there's just a lot of short form content out these days. And I think it's great for just quick kind of, getting headlines. But if you really want to get deep and understand how people think, you need to do it long form. And that's either like reading a long blog, which is fine. Hard to do that when you're driving, or doing some other stuff, or don't recommend it. But podcasts can get that same kind of, insight in a much easier and digestible format.
Mhm.
So that's the part that I really enjoy, is really digging deep and understanding people.
So the real deep question here is, how do you get the name Reboot?
Yeah, good question. You know what? I know I got a lot of flack for it from some people because they just didn't like the idea of rebooting health. They thought health works kind of just fine. Thank you very much. Um, but you know, I didn't think so. So initially the podcast was going to solely be on focusing digital
Mhm.
health, hence Reboot
Fair enough.
Health, like just like a computer, you reboot it up and off you go. I think I've decided that health innovation is too large to just put into digital health. I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by digital health. I consider it like the last mile of healthcare for sure. We need a lot of it, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going in other spaces. So the name stuck, and I just sort of expanded the other domains, as it were. So yeah, that was the concept, is Reboot Health, is sort of looking at innovation. How are we going to maybe not fully rebuild the healthcare system, but certainly, restructure it in a meaningful way, because I think it's long overdue. And I think there's some low hanging fruit, and there's some other things that will take as much longer to do. But I think, yeah, you got to plug away somewhere.
Mhm.
So this is my little bit to help innovation.
So talking about helping innovation, the last thing that we'll talk about is your recent senior directorship with Mars Health, with the Mars Health ecosystem. So I think there are two questions here. Number one, what is the Mars Health ecosystem? And number two, what do you plan to do, or what are you doing as the senior director?
Sure. So Mars is, I'll give you the tagline. Mars is the largest innovation hub in North America. And so what it does is it helps to support ventures at various stages through various means to basically deliver impact in whatever way that means. And one of our two, there are multiple domains, but one of our two largest are clean tech and health sciences. The others are sort of fintech and SaaS are the other domains that we work on. And so we take in ventures, again, at various stages. They could be seed, Series A, and sort of move them through various aspects and training for areas that they may not have within their sort of purview right now. So if that means they don't have a strong sales process, we'll help them to get a stronger process through advisors and through mentoring. If it means we know they need some help seconding another talent for their team to help build out the team, we'll try and make those connections. If it means capital, we'll help them connect capital. And the latter part, really sort of with the capital and the customers, that's really the ecosystem that we're building. So we work with other groups, organizations. We work with venture capitalists. We work with large multinational corporations as well, to basically, if you want to think about it, as soft land the venture into the ecosystem, depending on what they need. So we'll do a warm handshake with the VC. If the venture's ready, they've got a good product, they've got it built out, they've got a good team, they've got a great roadmap, then now they need the funding. We'll do a warm handshake with an appropriate VC that we have in our syndicate. Sometimes multinational corporations come in because they're not the greatest innovators, but they really want to know what's happening in their space. So they'll host various events, and then we'll showcase some of the technology from some of the ventures that we have in our portfolio. And they'll put on an event, whether it's a hackathon, whether it's a sort of a pitch session, whether it's something of this nature, we'll do that. And so those are sort of the major things that kind of go on in terms of and hooking them up with the ecosystem. And then there's other ecosystem players that, we'll talk to them. We'll have sort of regular meetings. If they've got some interesting ventures that are very early stage and need further talent that Mars can provide, we'll bring them on board in Mars and sort of circulate them through our programs and try and get them out the other end. So it's really trying to build a robust ecosystem with all the different players because, these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? I mean, building a business, you need customers, you need access to talent, you need access to capital. All that has to come. It comes repeatedly. It's not just a one-time thing. So it's really building a robust ecosystem where we can, get ventures to access those elements quickly, because one of the most costly things, resources any founder will tell you is time, because once the time's gone, it doesn't come back. So they really need to run and they really need to do this quickly. So that's kind of what we do to help them to navigate that. And obviously my focus is health sciences. So that incorporates medical devices, digital health, and biotech. So any ventures that come within the Mars ecosystem, those are the ventures that I focus on, helping to connect them to the VCs, to the other ecosystem players, as well as to sort of talent if that exists in the system.
That is an immense job, and honestly, it sounds that the work that Mars is doing to support ventures seems immensely important, to be able to put all the ingredients necessary to make a successful startup in one place. Because if you're spending time looking for these resources, that's again time wasted spent looking for resources and time failing spent looking for those resources too. But
exactly correct.
We're at about 58 minutes, so I recognize that we're running out of time. So I'll leave you some space here. Do you have any pluggables to plug?
No, I mean, I don't have any pluggables. I would encourage people, if they're interested in the health sciences space, to look at Health Impact Week at Mars, which is coming up probably in May or June. It's a great sort of 2-day conference that we host, where we kind of invite a lot of our ecosystem players, invite ventures and panelists to come and take a look at that. I'll do a shameless plug for my own podcast, reboothealth.io. So, if you want to listen to some great founders, not me and my jabbering, but some great founders in the ecosystem, have a listen there. And and if you're a clinician, I would say, take a look at HaloHealth if you're interested in getting more involved in the ecosystem. So would love to have you on board.
You've got so many plugs that I could mistaken you for Power Par. And you can find How It's Med at howitsmed.com and at howitsmed on Twitter and LinkedIn. Till next time.